who offer troves of civilian information and data related to the sociocultural structures, capabilities, organizations, and the people in general. Rahab told the spies that Jericho's inhabitants feared an Israeli invasion. Their success crossing the Red Sea, the destruction of Pharaoh's armies, and their recent defeat of more powerful enemies in battle made Jericho fear it was next. Rahab consents to help the spies escape the city and keep their mission secret if they would spare her and her family during the attack. The spies agreed and returned to Israel's encampment. They debriefed with Joshua alone, unlike the 12 spies speaking before the full assembly of Israel. And this here is a critical point, that they debrief alone with Joshua and not in front of all of Israel. And I'll get back to this point later. So the fact that Jericho was afraid of an Israel conquest is a critical point that traditional scholars who believe the biblical account to be literally true would point out, showing the strength of Yahweh. And as skeptics of the historical nature of the story would say that, well, this shows that it wasn't true, because archaeological excavations of the ruins of Jericho show its impressive size and historical legacy. The ancient city of Jericho lies 6 miles from the Jordan River and 8 miles northwest of the Dead Sea, offering an excellent water supply and a desirable trade location. It had been occupied since the early Neolithic period, and the oldest ruins date back to 8000 BC, making it one of the earliest inhabited cities in the world. But sitting at the crossroads of civilization meant that Jericho had to be well protected. If you were a wealthy city that wasn't well defended, you were just asking to be plundered. At any time, Egyptians could swoop out from the south or the Hittites from the north. To defend itself, Jericho had an inner and outer fortified wall several feet thick, stretching for a perimeter that enclosed 9 acres. Archaeological excavation shows that the city was rich, holding large stores of grain and contained valuable pottery. Returning to the Pentateuch account, Joshua was able to use the information provided by the 2 spies to plan a successful attack on Jericho. He presented his plan to the leaders of the 12 tribes. The plan was approved, the invasion prepared, and the attack and capture of the city proceeded with mechanical precision. The most memorable event in the biblical account of the conquest occurs when the Israeli army marches up to the walls of Jericho. They proceeded to march around the city once a day for 6 days, with 7 priests carrying ram's horns in front of the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day, they marched around the city 7 times. The priests then blew the horns, the people let out a mighty shout, and the walls crashed down. The Israelites charged into the city and completely destroyed it, along with its inhabitants. This story has endured in the consciousness of Judeo-Christian society, and it's inspired many medieval armies. During the First Crusade that lasted from 1095 to 1099, the European Crusaders recalled this story when they laid eyes on Jerusalem after years of fighting their way through Muslim armies of the Middle East. Filled with zeal, they marched around Jerusalem 7 times, hoping for a similar effect, or at least trying to invoke the spirit of the conquering Israelites. The walls didn't come crashing down, but the march boosted their morale and confirmed to them the piety of their mission. Well, going back to the Bronze Age, archaeological accounts differ on the time and manner in which Jericho was destroyed, but most scholars agree that it was violently destroyed by a military attack. The collapsed walls, stores of grain, and an ash layer indicate a fiery disruption in the city's settlement pattern. Although some occupants moved back into the city after its destruction and rebuilt on the rubble, they later abandoned it. Now, some archaeologists, such as Kathleen Kenyon, argue that Jericho had been abandoned before the date of the Israelites' arrival, meaning there was no city for them to capture at the time of the conquest, or just a few hundred inhabitants living among the ruin. But other archaeologists, such as John Garstang and Bryant Wood, support the sudden collapse theory, although it could be pinpointed to any number of attacks from different civilizations. So the account of the 12 spies is one of the earliest records of the use of spies. Although this story doesn't provide us detailed information, it does provide useful lessons on spying that John Cardwell commented on in his CIA report. He writes that the first lesson is to use spies that do not also possess political power. The 12 spies of Moses reported their findings publicly. They were leaders of the 12 tribes and part of the decision-making process around the possible invasion of Canaan. These 12 spies interpreted their findings through a politician's lens and in the most negative light possible, which affected the interpretation of the rest of the community. They were also speaking before their constituents, the members of their tribe, and they were political grandstanding just as much as they were actually giving an intelligence report. But Joshua's spies, in contrast, were not politicians or community leaders. They were only responsible for gathering information. They didn't attempt to twist the material or political grandstand, but only reported it in neutral terms because they were only speaking to Joshua. By looking at Moses' 12 spies and Joshua's 2, the CIA concluded that agents should conduct their activities in secret and only submit intelligence to the proper authorities, not to the community at large. An uneducated community is unable to interpret raw data in the same manner as military and espionage officials. They don't have the same access to classified information or access to high-level political authorities. In the case of Moses, he had access to God himself. Furthermore, the spies shouldn't be involved in any debate over the course of action as a result of the gathered intelligence. Keep your politicians or decision makers separate from your intelligence gatherers. Their job was to gather information, not to evaluate it. Furthermore, Caldwell notes, Moses used 12 amateur spies, each with political and military responsibilities to his own tribe. Each was a prominent person who cared more about flattering his constituency than providing useful intelligence. They only reported back on Canaan's agriculture and gave a crude physical description of its soldiers, while Joshua's 2 anonymous spies reported on the attitudes of the people and the enemy's military capabilities. Moses essentially allowed the tail to wag the dog. His spies were political competitors who weakened his authority, which led to a loss of political trust and resulted in a long period of severe national punishment. Joshua's operation, by contrast, was led by private professionals, and it led to the first of a series of military victories and the establishment of Israel's own kingdom. So the CIA report argues that many lessons can be learned from these examples. The spies of Joshua were cool, dispassionate professionals. They only reported to Joshua what they had been told and did not spend the information for political purposes. They made no moral judgment on the source of their information, a prostitute, nor did they believe that her information was invalid due to her background. They didn't force Rahab into any sort of religious conversion for her recruitment into their spy network, but merely asked for her conspiratorial silence. Joshua didn't rebuke the spies for recruiting her, and even honored the spies' agreement with her by rescuing her and her family from the Israeli invasion. No mention is made of what happened to her after she joined the Israelites and whether or not she resumed her old profession, although she probably didn't, since there were 1,000 ways to be stoned to death as a prostitute in the Levitical Code. According to Cardwell, the lesson is that spying should be conducted by professionals with no other military or political obligations that could compromise their mission. They should report in secret to higher authorities without debate. Sensitive topics should not be left open to discussion to parties without proper training in deciphering intelligence. Spies should also not participate in the policy-making process, nor should they take their cases to the public. If this does happen, the public, if not throwing literal rocks, will throw figurative rocks at the wrong people for the wrong reasons. It's a classic case of disorderly democracy. Moses' operation suffered from his own political considerations as well. He may have been pressured to select a leader from each of the 12 tribes due to nepotism, regardless of their actual ability. The specific instructions he gave were crafted to obtain approval from the 12 tribes, not to procure necessary information. All Israelites knew the operation was to occur, who was going, and what they were going to accomplish. Even though the spies completed all the mission objectives, their effort failed due to the mission briefing during the public discussions. Thus, the negative report of the spies and the loss of control of the situation occurred because of excessive oversight and the tightly controlled administrative procedures. As the CIA report describes, the operation was successful, but the patient died. Joshua, in contrast, did not have an oversight problem. He didn't have to worry about defining a politically acceptable mission scenario. His spies were sent covertly and given minimal instructions, merely to go, view the land, especially Jericho, and report back to Joshua alone. He handled all the administrative matters alone, provided flexible support to his spies by upholding their bargain with Rahab, and made necessary judgments required to successfully lead the Israelites to victory. It must have been an administrative nightmare for Joshua, but the operation still succeeded. Following the 1978 publication of Cardwell's report, the CIA didn't appear to heed all these warnings. Covert missions and attempts at foreign regime change continued throughout the 1980s, such as the attempted overthrow of the Sandinista government of Nicaragua the CIA's arming of Contras in Honduras, and its aid to rebels in Cambodia to fight the Vietnamese occupation. While none of these activities were any more amoral than typical CIA activity, the agency failed to keep its activities covert, and insiders leaked news of their illegal funding of the Contras to the press. The Iran-Contra affair was arguably the worst political scandal of the Reagan administration. So if there's any important lesson of the 12 Spies of Israel that's relevant to spy agencies today, it's that the morality of actions might be less important than how well they are kept under wraps. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Okay, so that's all for this episode. In the next episode of this two-part series on Spycraft in the Ancient World, we're going to be looking at two things. The first is Aeneas the Tactician, or Aeneas Tacitus, who wrote a treatise in the 4th century BC on how to defend your homeland. He was one of the earliest Western military advisors and writers to compose a tract on strategy and methods of encryption. We're also going to look at the Frumentarii in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, who were the spy and intelligence network of the Roman Empire. All right. Well, that is the episode for today, and I really appreciate you listening because it's you, the audience, that makes this show happen. And it's also you, the audience, that grows this show. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, and especially our spy masters, Baron Fraser, Carl from Norway, Chris from Maine, Moondoggy from Ohio, Vic and Irene, and Rick Knowlton, and I'll explain what that means in a second. If you would like to help support this show and help it reach new listeners who haven't discovered it yet, there's 4 easy ways for you to do it. First, subscribe to the show and leave us a review on the listening app of your choice. If you want to do that, you can go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com. 2, like us on Facebook and share posts about new episodes. 3, check out sponsors for the show. This is the best way to help me pay the bills because if sponsors see the audience is interested in their products, they will keep advertising. 4, you can become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were an elite reconnaissance and espionage detachment of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the History Unplugged membership program. Learn how to join by going to patreon.com/unplugged. So here's what you get if you become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you join at the level of Scout, you can get early access to new podcast episodes, along with enjoying absolutely every single episode of the History Unplugged podcast ad-free. All 270 and counting episodes. If you join at the level of Intelligence Officer, you can also get access to premium episodes, like a multi-part series on the life of Audie Murphy, the most decorated combat soldier in World War II, or the 10-part series Ottoman Lives, a series that looks at the cast of characters that made up the Ottoman Empire, such as the Sultan, the eunuch, the harem servant girl, and the soldier. And finally, if you join at the level of Spy Master, you get all the same stuff as the scouts and intelligence officers, but you also get a shout-out to you and or your business at the end of each episode, a 3-pack of hardcover history books, plus you will be put at the very front of the line for me to answer your question about history, and I can guarantee I will dedicate an episode that's about an hour long or so to your question. Sign up at patreon.com/unplugged. Again, that's patreon.com/unplugged. Anyway, those are the ways you can help out the show. Thank you so much for your support. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.